The Zulu people, largest ethnic group in South Africa, are primarily located in the KwaZulu-Natal province, have a rich history filled with conquest, resilience, and cultural vibrancy. It all began in 1879 in the warm hills where the mighty Zulu Kingdom stood tall. They were proud, disciplined, and had a king named Cetshwayo who wasn't too fond of visitors with rifles and imperial ambitions. Across the sea, the British Empire was in its collect all the lands phase. They had taken over parts of South Africa already and now had their eyes on Zulu territory. But the Zulu weren't interested in being part of the empire or drinking British tea. The Battle of Isandlwana was fought during the morning and early afternoon of 22nd January 1879 when a force of over 20,000 Zulus attacked a portion of the main British invasion force. Despite primarily only being armed with assegais and cowhide shields against an army equipped with modern Martin Henry rifle, the Zulus' athletism, discipline, and outright bravery won the day. Over 1,300 British were killed. The Zulu victory came at an appalling price as their casualties ran into several thousands. King Cetshwayo was heard to say, "An assegai has been thrust into the belly of the nation." On a hot, dusty African plain, an army of some 30,000 Zulu warriors carrying traditional spears and clubs wiped out almost every last man of a British force of some 1,500 men armed with modern rifles and artillery. An entire battalion was destroyed in the bloody massacre. It was an unprecedented military disaster that shook Britain to the core. For 64 dynamic years, Queen Victoria ruled the most powerful empire in the world, an empire on which the sun never set. Red-coated British soldiers were engaged in campaigns for Queen and country, but it was the defeat of the British Army at the Battle of Isandlwana in the Zulu War. The war began when the British gave the Zulu king Cetshwayo an impossible ultimatum: agree terms in a complex boundary dispute or be invaded. The heavily armed British force, led by Lord Chelmsford, advanced Rorke's Drift and into Zululand. Before this day, the British Army had been invincible. Their tactic was well-aimed volley fire by calm and experienced troops, supported by artillery. Their weapon was the Martini Henry rifle, a real man-stopper. The soft lead slug flattened on impact, causing massive tissue damage. Even if it did not kill, the victim would soon die of appalling trauma. Against the British stood Zulu army, well-trained but inexperienced in actual warfare. They were armed with leather shields, long spears, clubs, and the assegai, a short spear used for stabbing. By January 21st, most of the supremely confident British invaders had arrived at Isandlwana, a small mountain. The location was ideal. There was plenty of water and wood for cooking, and the position was easy to defend, elevated and with a steep rock face protecting much of its rear. It looked across the open plain towards the Zulu capital at Ulundi, so any approaching Zulu force would be observed for miles before it could attack. The British camp consisted of 750 tents neatly erected according to strict military regulations, and, within hours, the area was transformed into a bustling canvas town. Foot patrols were posted to the front of the camp, while mounted patrols were detailed to sweep the surrounding hills. But no defenses were prepared at Isandlwana camp itself. Just after midnight on January 22nd, Chelmsford received an urgent message from a patrol at the front of the British camp. A strong Zulu force had been seen, and more importantly, captured Zulus confirmed the imminent arrival of their army. But it was a brilliant decoy. Chelmsford decided to split his invasion force. At 3 a.m., he headed towards the Zulu capital with 2,500 men, leaving 1,500 men and two guns behind in camp, in case the enemy should have the temerity to attack during my absence. At daybreak, normal camp activities proceeded, and the bugle call for breakfast was sounded at 7 a.m. Then things began to go wrong. The first report came in from a nearby hill that a large Zulu force was advancing towards the camp. The bugler sounded the "stand to," the call to prepare for action. Breakfast was abandoned, and the soldiers collected themselves to meet the foe. But in the still African morning, nothing happened, and the soldiers relaxed. Then larger groups of Zulus appeared on a nearby hill, and the British were again stood to. A mass of Zulu warriors was seen running towards the rear of Isandlwana, but the British ignored them. The bugle call to prepare for action was sounded for the final time. It was only 10:30 a.m. and already a baking 40-degree centigrade temperature. To the horror of the soldiers, now spread out in a thin line half a mile long, 6 feet between each man, the central body of the main Zulu force, consisting of some 15,000 warriors, poured off the nearby hill and charged towards them. The two artillery guns started firing. Several rounds landed amid the advancing Zulus, causing carnage. But the Zulus quickly established the artillery's firing procedure and, as each gun was fired, threw themselves to the ground. It meant the shells passed over them and exploded harmlessly. But the charging Zulu regiments began to suffer heavily from British rifle fire. The officers and NCOs in the British front line calmly controlled their men's volleys, and the main attack was halted. British soldiers reportedly laughed and joked about the drubbing they were giving the Zulus. Captain Edward Essex, one of the 5 officers to survive, wrote, "I was surprised how relaxed the men in the ranks were despite the climactic tension of the battle. Loading as fast as they could and firing into the dense black masses that pressed in on them, the men were laughing and chatting, and obviously thought they were giving the Zulus an awful hammering. Then, unbelievably, another 15,000 Zulus appeared over the hill and closed in on the camp. But the Zulus didn't just charge straight at the enemy. Their tactics, which they had learned hunting herds of animals, also involved encircling the enemy with 2 arcing flanks, known as the horns of the buffalo, closing off all means of escape. This technique was introduced by Shaka Zulu. As the Zulu masses smashed into the British firing line, the sustained volley fire died away. Chelmsford's men, now 15 miles distant, were too far away to help. Yet at the height of the main attack, all the British soldiers complied with their orders to stand firm, even as the Zulus overwhelmed them. Firing as fast as they could, everyone desperately listened for the bugle call to retreat. When it finally sounded, it was too late. The Zulus had already broken through their line. The Zulus behind Isandlwana now emerged in force, driving the terrified cattle the British had brought with them through the wagon park and into the undefended rear of the British position. In camp, the scene was beyond nightmarish. Gunfire, screaming, noise, terror, confusion, and wholesale slaughter. The thick black smoke from the rifle fire just added to the pandemonium. The fighting raged for little more than 30 minutes before the sheer force of Zulu numbers overwhelmed the remaining soldiers, who died, as British soldiers do, bravely. The Zulus killed the soldiers, their horses, cattle, and camp dogs. Such was their fury. Only one soldier present when the attack began lived to tell the tale, but various accounts survive from Zulu warriors interviewed in the weeks after the battle. Ah, those red soldiers at Isandlwana! How few they were and how they fought! The camp was in possession of the enemy, who were killing the men as they ran out of their tents. We went right through them and out the other side, losing nearly all our gunners and 1 or 2 of the sergeants. The road to Rorke's Drift that we hoped to retreat by was full of the enemy. So no way being open, we followed a crowd of natives and camp followers who were running down a ravine. It was the worst defeat in the colonial history of the British Army. The British made a huge mistake. Lord Chelmsford split his army and left a big part of it camped at the base of Isandlwana mountain, without proper defenses. When Chelmsford and his men returned, they found an ocean of blood where the camp had been. Around 60 white people escaped, almost all before the battle began. There were 3,000 Zulus killed and 5,000 injured. Survivors of British soldiers from Isandlwana soon reached Rorke's Drift with news of the approaching Zulus. Lieutenants John Chard and Gonville Bromhead met with Assistant Commissary James Dalton to decide whether they should retreat or defend the station. Dalton argued that their small force, traveling in open country and burdened with hospital patients, would easily be caught by the fast-moving Zulus. So it was agreed that they would stay and fight. They set about building improvised barricades from mealie, maize, bags, biscuit boxes, and crates of tinned meat. The buildings were also loopholed for defense. The Zulu army arrived at Rorke's Drift at 4:30 p.m. They spent the next 12 hours continuously storming the British defenses, which were mainly held by soldiers of the 24th 2nd Warwickshire Regiment. At first, they were unable to reach the men behind the barricades with their spears. Many Zulu warriors were shot down at point-blank range, and the defenders forced back any who did manage to climb over. British soldiers who were too badly wounded to shoot were tasked with reloading guns and distributing ammunition to those who could still fire. Many of the Zulus who had firearms lacked training and were poor shots. As the battle raged on, the Zulus targeted the hospital. They set fire to the building, burst in, and began killing the patients with their spears. But the defenders managed to push them back with bayonets. The surviving patients were rescued after soldiers hacked holes in the walls separating the rooms and dragged them through and into the barricaded yard. As night fell, the British withdrew to the center of the station, where a final defense had been hastily built. They eventually succeeded in fighting the Zulus off. At the end of the fighting, 400 Zulus lay dead on the battlefield. Only 17 British were killed, but almost every man in the garrison had sustained some kind of wound. The British reinvaded Zululand 3 months later. They defeated the army, captured King Cetshwayo, and imprisoned him at Cape Town before abandoning the country, now in ruins. In 1882, Cetshwayo was taken to meet Queen Victoria in England, so impressing her that she ordered he be returned to his throne, which resulted in a bloody civil war and his death at the hands of his own people. In the broader context, the war highlighted both the might of imperial forces and the fierce resistance of indigenous African people. It left a lasting legacy of British in South African and Zulu history, remembered for its dramatic battles, tragic losses, and cultural clash between empires. For more videos on history content, like, comment, and subscribe. See you in next one.